If you're like me, you're trying to erase this from your memory, but I will remind you that a few months ago we had a priest here named Father Stephen Pellissier. And Father Stephen loved to speak about the upside-down man. So man with a well-ordered soul is led by his intellect. His intellect knows the good. He does the good as is known by the intellect in his will. And then the passions are submitted to reason, and they help us to have a fire in what we do. Now, often he would talk about how we live as upside-down men, right? That we are led by our passions take over and they're disordered. Our will is weak, and so we do what we desire through our passions. And then we try to convince our intellect that this was the good thing all along, to try to justify what we have done. Now, I'll give you a little example of this. It's not a moral example, but it's an example nonetheless. Probably a bad one, but it's an example. So we can know through maybe our own observations or through our doctors telling us that we need to be healthy. Random example, maybe our cholesterol is too high and the doctor wants to see that come down. Well, we know that we can do this by eating right, by exercising, and if we do this, it's crazy, but sometimes we even begin to desire these healthy habits. Right? Well, I kind of want to exercise because I feel a little better when I do it. And the green stuff that I have to put in my mouth and chew and swallow actually makes me feel kind of good. And so I'm starting to desire this stuff. We can know this, and we can do it, or perhaps, this is a random example, we can get home on a Friday night and say, you know what? I really like chocolate cake. And you know what chocolate cake goes really good with is ice cream. And we can eat that chocolate cake and the ice cream when we have the desire because our will is very weak. And then, in our cleverness to try to justify what we've done, we can say to ourselves, well, it is the optional memorial of St. Rose of Lima. And even though I refuse to celebrate her at Mass and in the liturgy, I can celebrate her by eating this delicious cake and ice cream. I'm an upside-down man when it comes to this. The same is true in the faith. Right? Intellectually, we should know the teachings of the Church. We should see them as good. We should have a will that is strong enough to be able to follow those teachings of the Church that we know are good. And they should purify and direct our passions. But the reality is that a lot of times we do the opposite. We have these sort of base desires. Our will is weak. We do the things that we know we ought not to do, and then we convince ourselves that it's not a big deal. And this comes up a little in the readings today. So in the first reading, we hear about the Israelites. The Israelites are tempted to stray away from the Lord, right? They have these passions, these desires that are leading them away from the God of Israel that they have come to know and to love. And so Joshua calls them to task, right? He says, are you going to give in to your desires? Are you going to give in to the things that are easier that you want to do, but you know you shouldn't do? Are you going to go and worship those other gods? And he gives them a couple of examples, right? You can go worship the gods over there, the gods over there. But as for me and my household, we're going to serve the Lord. And we hear the Israelites after this say, well, we're going to follow you. How dare we turn our backs on the God that we have seen work wonders in our lives? The God that has freed our ancestors from slavery. The God that has over and over again provided for us. And so Joshua is able to help the Israelites to live as men right side up. In the gospel, we hear something similar. We hear today in the gospel this concluding week of the Bread of Life discourse. We've been going through John chapter 6 this is the 6th week. And so Jesus has laid out his teaching on the Eucharist, right? The bread of life. That he will give us his own flesh and blood to eat and drink. And unless we eat and drink of it, we have no life within us. And the Israelites are a bit perplexed because they have been taught for many, many years that to eat flesh and to drink blood is not a good thing. And Jesus is telling them to do this. And so he knows that they are a bit confused, perhaps, and that they're grumbling among themselves. And I think it's interesting that it says that they're grumbling among themselves, not that they bring their complaints to Jesus. But Jesus knows that they're grumbling, and he approaches them and says, "Are you amazed that I say this?" And as he calls them to task, we hear that many of his disciples, not just random people that sort of, caught a glimpse of what was going on, but many of his disciples that had followed him, that had heard his teaching, that had watched him work miracles, that had become his friends, many of his disciples no longer followed him. And why did they leave? It says that there are some of you who do not believe. They hadn't accepted the teaching that he gave. Even though they had accompanied him, they hadn't come into an intimate, deep relationship with him. And because they didn't believe, whenever something difficult was presented to them, it was easy for them to walk away. It was easy for them to walk away. And it's always sad when we see this happen, right? When we see someone walk away from the Lord and walk away from the Eucharist. It's always incredibly sad. And we have to wonder why they leave. And I think there are many reasons, and this isn't the only reason, but I think the biggest reason why people can walk away from the Eucharist is because we don't truly know and understand and believe what the church teaches. And a big reason for that is because we, priests, have done a pretty bad job of teaching this. But if we really know and believe the church's teaching, that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus, and that those of us who receive it have everlasting life, then what could draw us away? What could draw us away? But if we eat of his flesh and drink his blood, we will live forever. And not in this world, but in the joy of heaven. I was reading something recently by Pope Benedict, and he loves to talk about this, right? How heaven is not just like an endless cycle of days, a sort of endless carrying on of this life. If that's what it is, then we would be right not to really want it. But that heaven, imagine the best moment of your life, the most joyful occasion you've ever experienced, and you just want to get lost in it, but you sort of come down from it and then you go on with the regular drudgery of life. Heaven is the best moment we could ever imagine and beyond, and it's never ending. And so why would anybody who actually knew they could have that want to walk away? Well, it's because we live like upside down men. Because we're driven by our passions, and our will is weak, and we don't listen to the intellect. We should desire, right, rather than living like those upside down men, to live as well-ordered men. Like St. Peter displays to us in today's gospel. Peter's a wonderful character because he's like simultaneously the most amazing person you've ever heard about and the biggest buffoon you've ever seen. At one moment he's saying something amazing, and the next he's just like sticking his foot in his mouth. But Peter shines today because Peter shows us how we are to live. Whenever Jesus questions the apostles, right, after many of them leave, many of the disciples leave, he doesn't sort of protect the apostles and say, well, I'll look like a real loser if I don't have at least 12 people following me. And we're going with this whole tribe of Israel theme, so we need to cling to these 12. No, he turns to them too, and he says, are you going to walk away too? And Peter, speaking up for the apostles, responds, we have come to believe. We have come to believe that you are the Holy One of God. And so where else are we going to go? Even though maybe my passions are stirring up, and I see that life could maybe be a little more simple if I walk away, I've come to believe, and my will is informed by that belief, and I'm able to say no to the easier thing, the thing that is going to maybe bring me immediate pleasure, because I know that sticking with you is good. Because I know that being with you brings eternal life. Right, this is what, as we're beginning this new semester, I thought of this in the context of what we do here at Wisdom. This is the type of formation that we try to provide. Right? One centered around the Eucharist. One that tries to form right side up men and women in an upside down world. Right? In a world that is saying to just do whatever is going to make you happy in the moment, we try to instill intellectual formation through the talks that we have, through hopefully our somewhat well-prepared homilies, through the Thomistic Institute lectures, through our Newman lecture, through John 15, through Bible studies. We try to form the intellect so that you can come to know and understand what is truly good. We try to form the will by this mean pastor that never lets us eat meat on Fridays when we go to the park. Right? By doing penance. By strengthening the will. By fasting one day a week if you're in BCB, the men's group. Right? By following the church's teachings on fasting and abstinence. Through doing these things, we strengthen the will so that they can do the good that we are learning in the intellect. And so that the intellect and the will can govern the passions, put them in their proper order, and give a fire to living the spiritual life. And this all stems from and flows back to a proper celebration of the Eucharist. Right? By coming here week after week, maybe day after day, and worthily receiving the Lord so that we can be strengthened. Right? So that our mind can be cleared to know better. So that our will can be strengthened to do what we know we ought to do. And so that those passions can be purified. And so we pray as we begin this new semester that we, with Joshua, when presented with all of these options, might say, I will serve the Lord. So that we, with Peter, whenever things get difficult, might be able to say, Lord, to whom shall we go? We have come to believe that you are the Holy One of God, and we will follow you.